When Keanu Reeves agreed to appear on the Vanessa Cross show, most expected an easygoing interview sprinkled with humble insights and that legendary calm. What no one expected was a verbal chess match, a sharp clash between authenticity and provocation. But as the lights dimmed and the audience held its breath, it became clear, tonight, someone would walk off that stage changed forever. And it wouldn't be Keanu. The studio buzzed with excitement. Overhead lights beamed down like artificial suns, casting a glossy sheen on the polished stage floor. Cameramen moved like shadows behind their equipment, silently choreographed. Rows of audience members fidgeted in their seats, holding up signs scrawled with admiration. Keanu is love, thank you for being you, and be more like Reeves. Then the silence cracked open. 3, 2, the floor director's fingers ticked down as the glowing red camera light flared to life. Applause erupted, and Keanu Reeves walked in. Clad in a plain black shirt and a soft, charcoal blazer, his jeans slightly faded, Keanu's unassuming look contrasted starkly against the glamour of the set. His presence, though, required no flash. His calm demeanor and quiet strength blanketed the room like a weighted breath. He smiled gently, giving a small wave, his long dark hair brushing the tops of his shoulders. The audience's cheers softened into a reverent hush as he took his seat. Across from him sat Vanessa Cross. Known in media circles as the Velvet Razor, Vanessa was a master of control, her interviews more like surgical dissections. Tonight, she wore a red power suit that commanded attention, her silver blonde hair pulled into a tight twist. Her expression? Polished, yet charged with something sharper beneath. In her hand, a stack of cue cards. On her face, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Keanu," she began, voice smooth as glass, "you've achieved what most can only dream of. Fame, fortune, influence. Yet here you are, riding the subway, donating millions, avoiding the luxuries your peers chase like oxygen." She leaned in just slightly, eyes gleaming. "Does any of that really make a difference in the world?" The air cooled. Some audience members shifted in their seats. The question had a bite to it, not curiosity, but challenge. Keanu didn't flinch. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, with the same measured tone he used when comforting strangers or answering questions with soul instead of spin, he smiled. "Vanessa," he began, and what followed would be the first move in a game she hadn't prepared to lose. "Vanessa," Keanu said again, this time with a warmth that felt out of place on such a meticulously hostile stage. "May I ask, how do you define making a difference?" His voice didn't waver. No hint of sarcasm. Just genuine interest. Vanessa blinked. That wasn't on her cue cards. "I'm the one asking questions, Keanu," she replied with a practiced chuckle, trying to regain her rhythm. "But sure, I'll bite. Making a difference? Its impact. Tangible results. Numbers. Policy. Influence. Not waving at strangers on the subway." A few members of the audience laughed, uncertainly. But Keanu kept his gaze steady. "Interesting," he replied softly. "Because I think sometimes the smallest gestures reach the furthest. Kindness is its own kind of influence, don't you think? Especially when no one's watching." The crowd murmured, some nodding. Vanessa didn't flinch, but her posture shifted ever so slightly. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" she countered. "That being nice somehow solves real problems? You're adored, sure, but let's be honest. Adoration doesn't fix poverty. Smiles don't rebuild broken systems." Keanu took a slow breath. He didn't speak immediately. He let her words settle in the air like smoke. Then, with perfect calm, "You're right. Smiles don't rebuild systems, but they do rebuild people, and people rebuild systems." The room fell into a hush. "And sometimes," he continued, "when someone's at their lowest, it's not policy they need. It's hope." Vanessa's lips tightened. This was supposed to be a takedown, an expose. But somehow, Keanu wasn't deflecting, he was redirecting. Not dodging the blow, but gently turning it into something deeper. She glanced at the next card and smiled. Fine, she thought. Time to go for the jugular. "Let's talk about grief," she said, her voice dropping into a sharper register. "You've lost people. A lot of people. Your daughter. Your partner. Your best friend. You've said grief never ends. But tell me, Keanu, how much of your kindness is just guilt dressed up in a suit?" The crowd gasped audibly. The trap had been set, and the room waited to see if he'd fallen. For a long, breathless moment, Keanu didn't answer. Not because he didn't have a reply, but because he was feeling it. The weight of Vanessa's question, crafted to wound, not to understand, hung heavy in the air. The kind of question meant to crack a man open in front of the world. His fingers rested gently on the armrest, not clenched. His eyes didn't harden, they deepened, like a tide pulling back before a quiet storm. The audience could feel it too. And then he spoke. Not loud, not defensive, but with a rawness that no camera could fake. You know, Vanessa, Keanu said slowly, it's a fair question. Pain leaves echoes. Grief becomes part of your wiring. And yes, sometimes the way I live, how I give, how I interact, it is influenced by what I've lost. He paused. But guilt? His eyes locked with hers. No, I don't live this way out of guilt. I live this way because I remember. The room held its breath. I remember the look in my daughter's eyes before she passed. I remember Jennifer's laugh. River's spirit. These weren't just losses, they were lessons. Lessons in how fragile people are. How valuable a kind word can be when everything else is falling apart. Vanessa swallowed hard. This wasn't the broken man she had hoped to reveal. This was a man rebuilt by pain. Stronger, softer, sharper. He leaned forward slightly. You call it guilt. I call it gratitude. For the time I had with them. And for the chance to still be here, trying to make someone else's day just a little bit lighter. A woman in the audience wiped her eyes. Another reached for the hand of the person beside her. Even the cameras, usually emotionless lenses, seemed to pause as if they too were caught in the gravity of the moment. And Vanessa? She was staring at her cue cards, as if they were suddenly written in a language she didn't understand. She'd gone in for blood and gotten grace. But she wasn't done yet. And neither was Keanu. Vanessa forced a smile, but her fingers betrayed her, tapping lightly against the edge of her cue cards. That last exchange hadn't gone how she planned. The crowd had shifted, leaned in. Their expressions softened, not toward her, but toward the man she'd tried to unravel. Still, she wasn't done. She needed control back. Touching, she said coolly, but let's not forget, you're an actor. Your job is to perform. How can anyone know what's real with someone who spent their life pretending to be other people? It was a knife in a velvet glove. Keanu's expression didn't change, but his silence, it sounded different now. Then, in a voice that felt like it could quiet a hurricane, he replied. Pretending is easy. Being is hard. He sat back, the studio lights catching the glint in his eyes. I act for a living, sure, but I've never faked who I am. The problem isn't that people pretend on camera. It's that too many pretend off it. He let that settle. Like when someone builds a career asking questions, but never listens to the answers. Vanessa's smile froze. The audience shifted. Keanu wasn't being rude. He wasn't raising his voice or mocking her. But the words cut cleaner than any insult. Because they were true. He looked around, gesturing lightly to the crowd. You want to talk about authenticity? He continued. These people didn't show up tonight to see me dodge a spotlight. They came because in a world full of noise, kindness still echoes. A long beat passed. Then he turned back to Vanessa. And I wonder, Vanessa, if the roles were reversed, if the cameras were off, who would you be? Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. It was like being asked a question by a mirror. And for once, she couldn't read from a card. Behind her, the producers whispered frantically. This wasn't the segment they'd planned. But something more real, more human, was unfolding. Something no script could control. Keanu leaned forward one last time, his voice almost a whisper. Being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. And honesty? That's the one thing no spotlight can fake. The crowd erupted in applause, not explosive, but earned. The kind that said, we see you, we hear you, and we believe you. Vanessa blinked against the lights. But now, they didn't feel like they were aimed at Keanu. Vanessa took a sip from her water, but it didn't help. Her throat felt dry, as if the words she wanted to say had turned to dust before they could reach the surface. Keanu didn't press her. He just waited, not with arrogance, but with presence. The kind that made you feel like you were being seen, not as a persona, not as a brand, but as a person. And under that kind of gaze, even the most polished walls begin to crack. And then he did the unthinkable. He leaned in, gently placed his hands together, and said, Can I ask you something? A ripple went through the crowd. Vanessa blinked. Me. Keanu nodded. Yeah, just one. This wasn't in the plan. This was her stage. Her show. Yet something in Keanu's tone made it impossible to say no. All right, she said, trying to sound composed. Keanu didn't miss a beat. When was the last time, he asked, you did something kind, without telling anyone? Boom. The question hit like a soft grenade, quiet but impossible to ignore. Vanessa's lips parted. But no words came. I mean, Keanu continued, his voice gentle, we live in a world where everything's recorded, tweeted, posted, filtered. But kindness, the real kind, it's quiet. It doesn't need a headline. It doesn't even need a witness. Vanessa stared at him, the cue cards in her hand now useless props. And for the first time that night, she looked unsure. I don't know, she admitted, her voice faltering. I guess I've never thought about that. Keanu nodded, not triumphantly, but understandingly. That's okay. Most people don't. But the beautiful thing about kindness is, it doesn't keep score. It's never too late to start. Someone in the back row wiped their eyes. The energy in the room had shifted again, but not just toward Keanu. Now, it was shifting toward truth. Even the cameraman, used to detached professionalism, seemed slower behind the lens, watching not just a celebrity interview, but something human unfolding. Vanessa looked down at her cards, then back at Keanu, and said softly, that was a good question. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need to be followed by applause. Vanessa sat in stillness, the sharp angles of her posture softened now, almost reflective. Keanu's question still lingered in the space between them, hanging like a feather that refused to land. Then, something unexpected happened. A voice. From the audience. Mr. Reeves, a young woman called gently from the third row. The cameras instinctively panned, the stage crew scrambling, but Keanu simply turned and nodded with quiet permission. Go ahead. She stood slowly. Early 20s. Nervous. But her voice, though soft, was steady. I just wanted to say thank you for what you said about grief earlier. My dad passed away last year. I haven't been the same since. And hearing you talk about remembering instead of guilt. I don't know. It helps. Keanu gave a small bow of his head, eyes gentle. I'm sorry for your loss, he said softly. And I'm glad you're here. The crowd clapped gently. Not out of obligation, but support. Then someone else stood up, a man in his 60s, weathered hands and eyes that had clearly seen sorrow. I lost my wife to cancer 3 years ago, he said. Felt like no one understood. But you do. You just do. Keanu didn't respond with words. He simply pressed a hand over his heart. The audience, once a silent wall of spectators, now pulsed with raw humanity. One by one, they shared small truths. Stories of loss. Moments of kindness. Questions about healing. The energy shifted from interview to intervention, a room full of strangers connected by something deeper than celebrity. And in the middle of it all, Keanu Reeves sat, not as a movie star, not as a talking point, but as a witness. A human being. A bridge. Vanessa looked around, her carefully curated show slipping out of her grasp. And yet, for once, she didn't seem to mind. She slowly set down her cue cards and just listened, because what was happening now was real. The studio had transformed. What began as a typical talk show now felt more like a sacred space, where grief was honored, kindness wasn't weakness, and masks quietly slipped away. Vanessa sat still, no longer the predator with the piercing questions. Her cue cards lay untouched beside her, forgotten. Her eyes, which had once scanned the room like a hawk's, now stared forward, somewhere deeper than the lights. And then Keanu spoke again, softly. You know, he said, turning toward her without force or judgment, when I walked in tonight, I expected questions. He paused. But I didn't expect a room full of people sharing their hearts. You helped make that happen. Vanessa blinked. Me. Keanu nodded. You tried to challenge me. And I get it. That's your job. But challenge can sometimes become connection if we're open enough to let it. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, not dramatic, but sincere. So I'll ask one more thing. Not as a guest. Just as a fellow human. Vanessa swallowed, bracing herself. What's the hardest thing? Keanu asked. You've never said out loud? Silence. Raw. Immediate. Penetrating. The kind of question you can't deflect with charm or wit. The kind that hits straight to the gut and waits. Vanessa looked down. For the first time all night, the confident journalist looked small. Not weak, but exposed. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Tried again. Then, barely above a whisper. When I lost my brother. I didn't cry. The words surprised even her. I was so busy being strong for my parents, for everyone. I never gave myself permission. And I think I stopped feeling anything at all for a long time. The air shifted again, this time around her. No one clapped. No one spoke. They simply held space. Keanu's voice was a whisper now. Thank you for trusting us with that. And it wasn't a line. It wasn't good TV. It was real. As real as the trembling breath Vanessa took as a tear finally slid down her cheek, the first public crack in an armor built over years of pretending. In the control booth above the stage, panic was rising. This wasn't the segment they pitched to advertisers. This wasn't celebrity culture or ratings gold. This was human, raw, unpredictable, and unpredictable scared executives. Through her headset, the stage manager's voice crackled. "We need to cut to commercial. Now." A red light blinked at the edge of the set, the signal for Vanessa to rap. Producers waved silently behind the camera, drawing their fingers across their necks in the universal cut-it motion. Vanessa saw it. Keanu saw it. But instead of following the cue, Keanu calmly stood. The audience stirred. He stepped forward, not off stage, but toward Vanessa. And then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, worn at the corners, soft from being handled too many times. He set it gently on the table between them. "I carry this with me," he said. "It's a quote from a book I read years ago. I don't show it to many people, but I think you're supposed to have it now." The studio was dead silent. Vanessa slowly picked it up, her fingers trembling just slightly as she unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the words, and then widened. "Grief is just love with nowhere to go." She read it again, slower this time, like she needed to let it sink in through every layer of her. And when she looked up, her face was different, softer, honest, like the years of forced poise had suddenly fallen away. "I've never heard it put like that," she whispered. Keanu smiled. "It helped me once. Maybe it can help you too." One of the producers made a move toward the stage, but the audience, sensing what was happening, stood up. They didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They just rose, quietly, in solidarity, like they knew they were witnessing something sacred and commercial breaks didn't belong here. The cameras kept rolling. But now, they weren't capturing a celebrity interview. They were capturing a moment of healing. Vanessa wiped a tear. Not quickly, not apologetically, just humanly. And across from her, Keanu gave the slightest nod. A nod that said, "You're not alone anymore." The lights dimmed. The cameras powered down. The applause faded into quiet murmurs as the studio began to clear. Vanessa stood slowly, still clutching the folded piece of paper Keanu had handed her. Her expression was unreadable until you looked at her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a TV host anymore. They were the eyes of someone who had just been cracked open in front of everyone and had somehow found peace in it. Keanu stepped beside her. No words, just a gentle presence. They walked off stage together, no entourage, no handlers. Just two people who had walked through something real. Inside the dimly lit green room, Vanessa sat down on the couch and stared at the paper again. That quote, "Grief is just love with nowhere to go," was now etched into her. She looked up at Keanu, who stood near the window, sipping a lukewarm tea like it was sacred. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. He turned. "Didn't say anything. I came here thinking I'd unravel you," she continued. "Make you crack. I wanted to prove. I don't even know what anymore." Keanu tilted his head, gently. Vanessa laughed, soft, self-conscious. "You didn't just handle it. You taught me. And the worst part is she looked down at the paper again. You did it without trying to win." Keanu smiled softly. "There's no winning in healing," he said. "There's just honesty and timing." Vanessa nodded slowly, taking it in. "You know," she said, voice thinner now, "I spent most of my career hiding behind questions because I was too afraid to answer any myself. But tonight, for the first time, I think I stopped hiding." Keanu set his tea down. "You didn't stop hiding," he said gently. "You invited yourself out. That's braver than most people ever get." A long pause. Then Vanessa did something that surprised even her. She reached for his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu squeezed gently in return. "No need," he said with that familiar, humble smile. "You already did the hard part." And just like that, the woman who had built a career on hard edges felt something soft bloom in her chest. Not defeat, not shame, growth. The next morning, the internet lit up. Clips from the interview spread like wildfire, not because of scandal or a viral soundbite, but because of something far more rare: authenticity. Headlines didn't scream controversy. They whispered truth. Keanu Reeves turns interview into a masterclass on grace. TV host breaks down on air, not from pressure, but kindness. When Hollywood's quietest star asked the most important question, viewers around the world didn't just watch, they felt. Comment sections became confessionals. People shared their own grief, their quiet acts of kindness, their long-held guilt, and the healing that came from realizing they weren't alone. A hashtag began to trend, hashtag kindness without witness. And under it, stories. Hundreds. Thousands. A nurse who left flowers anonymously for a grieving widow. A man who forgave a father who'd never said sorry. A teenager who stood up for a classmate without ever revealing it was them. Vanessa Cross, once known for cutting interviews and viral stings, released a statement days later. But it wasn't polished PR. It was a letter, handwritten, scanned and posted online. I thought my job was to expose people, but I've learned it's far more powerful to understand them. Thank you, Keanu, for holding up a mirror and not turning away when I finally looked into it. And Keanu? He never tweeted about it, never addressed it in interviews, never turned it into a brand or a badge. He just kept doing what he's always done.